It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind, and it either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better... Sir? Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
This is Alicia from Kennesaw, Georgia, and you're listening to the best podcast on the planet, Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dean tonight, who comes to us from Oklahoma. And Dean's going to be sharing with us what it was like to grow up over the last 50 years on this property. And the first time he actually saw the creature, he was a little boy. And I'll kind of let Dean go into it. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Dean to the show. Dean, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome.
Thank you again for being here. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things tonight. But let's kind of start from the very beginning. If you would, tell me about this property and kind of walk me into what happened the first time that you saw it.
You know, I was unsure of exactly when it happened. I knew it was right before my parents divorced, but when I was 35, I actually brought the day up to my mother and father, who were still alive then, and asked them if they remembered that day, and they did. Talking it out, we deduced it was in October or early November, right before they separated, of 1975. And I was going to school up here in Antlers, Oklahoma. Rode a school bus out about 5 miles west of town, where we leased a house from an old bootlegger. And he had a store here on Highway 3 in a little community called Darwin, and he had 3 rent homes on it. We were leasing one of them. But anyway, we're coming up from school, and my brother riding the bus. I had a sister, but she was real little at the time. And when we got home from school, my dad was an avid hunter and a fisherman, and he had bird dogs. And our job was to take care of those dogs as soon as we got off that bus. So we went out to their pens and buying this rent home, and watered and fed and cleaned up their pen. And my brother went back in the house, and 100 yards behind this rent home, there was a giant cyclone fence encircled this wooded property. And we were told not to go back there. But I had dug me away underneath that fence, and I used to go back and play in those woods. It was just something to do, you know. Nothing else to do out here, basically. Go fishing, a little pond next to the property there. Used to fishing. Anyway, I had a half Walker Hound, half Beagle dog, is what we had, that ran loose. He was kind of our pet. He wasn't he was a hunting dog, but anyway, he was always with us if we was outside. So he was with me, and he'd crawl under with me, and we'd run around the woods. And so when my brother went in, I decided I'm going to crawl under that fence and go back and play in the woods. I probably got 100 yards into the woods behind the house, no farther than that probably. But we're going along, dog's out in front of me. I'm just kind of watching the dog, probably 10, 15 feet behind it. All of a sudden, this dog, he was such a good hunting dog, people and family and friends used to come borrow him. So he was used to the woods and wild animals. Anyway, he yelped, turned, and ran by me just as fast as he could. And so I'm watching him, and as he ran by me, I'm looking at him, and he's heading back toward the house. As fast as he could go. I'd never seen him act like that. And when I turned and looked back to where he had come from, standing probably 20 to 25 feet in front of me, in a little opening in the trees there, stood, for lack of a better description, a gigantic, hairy humanoid of some kind. As a 7.5-year-old boy, it was a monster to me, is what it was. I never heard it. I don't know where it came from. I never heard it. But all of that I can figure is the dog, when it became aware it was there, the dog hightailed it. But when I turned back around and saw it, I was frozen. I could not move. Every instinct in my body, I wanted to scream, holler, and run, but I was frozen with fear. First time I'd ever been that way, but the guy, I'll call it a guy because it was some type of a ancient, prehistoric type man. It's the only way I can describe it, a caveman, if you will. And I'm looking up at it, because it's huge. I've never stood next to another human being that even comes close to how big this thing was. I'm kind of frozen on its face, and my top of my head probably come between its knees and its waist if I was guessing, So I'm locked, looking up, just frozen. And it's just looking at me. And I can't move, I can't holler, and it's not moving. It's not making a noise. And have you ever seen an old dog when he'll lock in something he's curious about, he'll tilt his head? This thing did that, looking at me. Tilted its head sideways, It stood there, just standing there with his arms down the side, and tilted its head and showed me its teeth. And I swear it was, over the last, which is fixing to be 50 years since this happened, I thought about it, and I think it was smiling at me. I really do, It just showed its teeth and tilted its head and stared at me. I couldn't do anything if I wanted to. I was just frozen. And it looked at me for, it seemed like an eternity. When you're that afraid, time, it seemed like it took forever, but it probably, I thought about it a lot, it's probably, guessing, maybe 40 to 50 seconds. He stood there in front of me, just looked at me, then just took a step to the right. Went in behind this big, what I know now to be a cedar tree, big fluffy green tree. And that's where it had come from. I guess it stepped out from behind that tree. That's why I didn't see it when we come up on it, and the dog didn't eat it. And but the dog was out front when it came around to the side of the tree. I guess the dog seen it or, whatever, knew it was there and took off. But I never did until it stepped out, and then it stepped behind the tree. And when it stepped behind the tree, all of a sudden, I could move. And I immediately turned and headed toward the house as fast as I could run. But like I said, after something like that happens, I don't know how to explain it, but my legs didn't seem to want to work. I guess maybe I was in shock. I don't know. But crawl back under the fence, get to the house, run in and tell my mom. She was in the kitchen. My dad wasn't there. I guess my brother was in our room. I don't know where he was at. Anyway, all she said was, you ain't supposed to be back there, and kind of whooped me. She said, I'll tell your dad. You know he'll whoop you. And I knew that for sure, so I didn't want her to tell him. So I just go outside, and I get to thinking, where's my dog? Where's Sambo? That dog, he was headed for the house when he took off from this thing. He was underneath the house, and I couldn't get him to come out. It's an old, set up on an old 3-cinder block foundation. The old house did. And it had the openings in the cinder blocks, and he had got under there, and I could not get him out. He would not come out. I've seen him under there. He's just laying flat to the ground. I don't know when he finally did come out, but he never did before dark. So I go in, and I sit there for a while on the porch just trying to comprehend, what I seen, and I'd walk to the edge of the house and look, make sure this thing wasn't coming, following me. And so anyway, I go in and tell my brother, and I guess him and my mom just thought it was a hunter or something back there. What I didn't know then was it was the woods that I only knew right there by the house was actually 2,400 acres altogether at that time. I found out years later, but so nothing more was said, and anyway, came our bedtime. I'm gonna guess probably 9:30. We're in bed, and me and my brother slept in a room together, an old army cots, little single army cots is what we had. Mine was across the room from a window, about 12 feet from a window. We had one window in the little old room. It probably wasn't 12 by 14, the room. But I'm laying there on my left side looking at this window on the south side of the house, just kind of laying there. Couldn't go to sleep after what had happened. I'm still thinking about it. And in the top left corner of that window appeared the face that I had seen earlier in the woods. And it was either the same one or it has a twin. It looked identical, and it's staring at me through the window. And once again, when I saw it, I couldn't move. I just was frozen with fear again. My brother's feet were at the window. He was on the south wall of his bed. His feet were at the window, but his head was in the corner of the room, so he couldn't see out the window. He was still awake. But he's laying on his side, looking at me on the opposite side of the room, and I could hear him saying, Dean, Dean, trying to get my attention, I guess the look on my face or something we didn't talk about later, but I guess that's what it was. He couldn't figure out what was going on with me, but I couldn't answer it. Like I said, I was frozen. And so he looked where I was looking, and he had to lean up and out off his cot to look out the window because he's up against the wall that the window's on. So he had to lean up and out, but when he did, he saw this thing. And this thing saw him. He didn't know he was there before because he couldn't see my brother in that corner of the room, the way it was all set up. Because his eyes got big, and his head turned and looked at my brother, and my brother immediately jumped up and started hollering and run out of the room. And when he did that, I could move, and I followed him out. Well, just so happens that night, my father was home. He usually worked, when he did, was on, his shifts were at night at the toll booth down here at the Antlers exit off the Indian Nation Turnpike. But he was off that night, I guess, because he was there. And he slept in a separate room from our mother and our little sister. She was kind of sickly. She was a 7.5-month premature baby, only weighed 2 pounds when she was born, so she slept in a bed with my mom. My dad slept in a den at the front of the house. But he come immediately, and my mom come immediately when they heard my brother hollering, and they met us in the hallway between these 3 rooms. I remember my father grabbing my brother, asking him, what is it? What is it? And my brother said, there's a monster at the window. He described it as a monster. That was his exact words. And I'm just standing behind him. I wasn't saying nothing. I was probably in shock again. Like I said, I was scared to death. But my dad asked him what it looked like, and he said, it looked like a black man with a beard. I remember him saying that. And when I asked my father about it when I was 35, my father remembered Mike describing it that way. You know? Well, my father, like I said, avid hunter, he even loaded all of his shells, shotgun shells, rifle shells, pistol shells. He had all the equipment to do it in that room he slept in. He always had a loaded gun right there handy. He grabbed the gun and went out immediately. And when I asked him about it when he was 35, I don't remember what was said later on that night. I was too scared, I guess. But he never saw nothing. Never heard nothing. Can't figure out because, like I said, it was about 100 yards to anything on any direction from that house and pretty open, you know. There was some few big trees, but not a lot. So where it went, where I got there that quick, I don't know. Because it couldn't took him more than 30 seconds to 40 to get outside to the back of the house. But yeah, that happened in fall of 1975. That was my first, and I had no reference point. I never heard of what I later would, you know, hear the term Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wild man, 1,000 other terms around the world. Until a year later, after my parents divorced, we moved in with my grandmother and we went to Oklahoma. I'm sitting in a movie theater and a documentary called The Mysterious Monsters was playing. And of course, you know, me and a bunch of little friends are in there. Probably shouldn't even been watching it back then, you know, but we're scared to death. And they're portraying and talking about Bigfoot on this film. And they've got people dressed up, you know, and it's similar to what I saw. So I'm thinking to myself, that's when it kind of hit me, you know, that maybe this is what I saw, you know. And that led me down what is fixing to be 50 years of kind of, I won't use the term researching, but reading and watching everything I can about the subject, you know, just trying to understand how, you know, something like what I saw could exist and not everybody know about it, you know. That was my first sighting.
And Dean, you said it reminded you of a man. Would you kind of describe what you saw?
Yeah, you know, I've never owned a computer, and I didn't know people were talking openly about this subject until about 8 years ago when I got a smartphone. And, but anyway, that being said, I've watched a lot of stuff on this smartphone since I got it, and I keep hearing the term animal, and I don't know what other people are seeing. You know, they may be seeing something completely different than what I have over the years, but rest assured, what I seen was no animal. This was some type of humanoid, a man. And to describe it, black skin looked like leather, wrinkled on the face, black hair, probably. It had varied lengths. I'm looking at the front of it, full-on frontal view. But it was daylight. You know, I got a good look from where my head was positioned when I locked on it because I couldn't move. So I'm looking from basically mid-thigh up to the head, you know, what I could see out of my peripheral vision. I'm actually locked onto his face. And eyes and ears and nose and mouth just like us. Flat nose, very large, heavy eyebrow above the eyes. The eyes were, I don't think they were inset, it's just that the eyebrow ridge stuck out so far, it kind of gave them that effect, you know, of being inset. Big ears, I remember those. The hair varied in lengths on what I could see. Wasn't all that long on the head, but it had a beard that, you know, wasn't real long, but it didn't hang down, you know what I'm saying? It was short, and the mustache didn't even seem to come together under the nose like a normal modern man's mustache. It was just kind of coming up from the beard a little ways, kind of halfway to the nose. And as down the front, where the hair was thinner on the chest and the top of the abdomen, the skin looked to be lighter than what was on the face. I don't know, you know, how you would term it, a light black as opposed to the dark black skin on the face of it. And as I'm looking at it, it seemed like the hair on the shoulders and down, maybe on the back or side of the arm is the impression I got, was longer than on the front of the arm, you know, and on the abdomen and top of the stomach. And then it got thick down on the groin, and it was definitely a male. Okay? That was obvious. And then the hair got thicker, like I said, around the groin and on the thigh. And that's kind of all I could, you know, really remember seeing, because like I said, I couldn't even move my eyes, if that seems even possible, but that's how, I mean, I was just frozen. But there was a break in the trees. We're in kind of a, you know, it's kind of a shaded area. There's a big, I want to say an oak probably behind it that is standing in a big tree, you know, with light coming in, but there was a big beam of, a big section of light that came in from the right side. And what was interesting, what I remember was where the sunlight hit on its right shoulder and its right side, all the other hair appeared to be black, but where the sunlight hit it, it appeared to be a silvery, grayish, kind of bluish tint to it. It's hard to describe. It was weird. But I remember that standing out, you know, that section where the bright sunlight was hitting it looked a different color than the rest of the hair, you know. So I'm not sure what that means, but I've often wondered, you know, whether, if you've ever seen a wild turkey, if their feathers, you get one and lay it out in the sun and move the wings, and it'll actually change colors based on the angle it is to the sun. And I've often wondered whether these things, or what I've seen, its hair kind of did that, you know. And when the sun hit it, it kind of shone or reflected and kind of changed its appearance, as opposed to if it was not in direct sunlight. The size of this thing, I mean, who knows? But I can tell you this, 10 years, well, not even 10 years, about 8 years later, I'm sitting on the 8th row of a professional wrestling ring in Oklahoma City at the Myriad Convention Center, on the row where the bad guys come out. And there was a wrestler back then by the name of Andre the Giant, and he walked right by me. And so 8 years from then, you know, I was 15 years old, whatever. That's the closest I've seen to the mass of this thing, and he wasn't close. So I was guessing what I saw had to have weighed, you know, conservatively 600 pounds to max, maybe 1,000 pounds, a half a ton. I mean, it was just tremendous mass. Height-wise, you know, I've been around some basketball players that were 7'1", 7'2". This thing was a lot taller than any other modern human that I've been close to. Andre the Giant, they listed him at 7'4", but he was actually about 7 foot, a little bit less. This thing was 2 heads taller than what Andre the Giant was. So I'm guessing 8 to 10 feet maybe, height-wise. Top end, maybe 10. But at least 8, 8.5, you know, conservatively. But I think it was more closer to 10. It was just massive. Incredible size to this thing. Like I said, I've never seen any modern man, and I've known some really big guys. I used to work security at nightclubs, Oklahoma City, surrounding area, and had a lot of run-ins with some big tough guys, and nothing like what this was. This is incredible, just absolutely stunning. The size, like I said, it was a monster as a boy. That's what I would call it. Now, you know, I've heard other people say that, and I understand why they would say it. But like I said, I've never, what I saw in 2 consecutive years in 96 and 97 when I was hunting with some gigantic brothers. The 2 oldest brothers of this group that invited me up to hunt with them in an area called One Creek Valley, which is northeast of Amherst, between little communities called Finley and Snow. Runs east off Highway 271. And anyway, 96, I saw something leading out from behind the house. We were trading beer cans for hay. got real cold, that deer whitetail gun season is when I was up there camping. These guys invited me up, and it was the second year I was up there with them. And me and the oldest brother, who was about 6'8", 375 pounds, without question, the baddest human being I've ever known. He was something else. But I ride with him in his Jeep down to trade beer cans to this family up the road from where we were camping there in the valley for hay. It rained so much it got muddy, and our enclosure we'd built up in the trees there, we were, water was running in. We were dragging mud in from outside, and so we wanted to put hay down on the floor. Anyway, we go down to trade with him. He told me he'd done it before. I hadn't. I just, like I said, they'd just invited me up there. But we go up, and out walked this old woman from the house when we pulled in there, and two younger guys, probably mid-20s to 30. They were some big dudes. These guys were 6'4", 6'5", 300 pounds, and very strange-looking guys. I hate to use the term inbred, but these guys might have been. They just had a simple look about them, if you know what I mean. But anyway, we're standing there, and of course the guy I'm with doing the talking, I'm just standing behind him. He tells him what he wants, and the old lady tells one of the boys to go get us a couple bales of hay for us, and tells the other one to get the beer cans in bags. We had them bagged up in trash bags, get them out of the Jeep. And we're standing there talking. Anyway, they get that done, and Ron's talking to the old woman, the mom. She was the mother of these two things, I guess. That's how she introduced them as her sons. I'm just listening, not saying nothing. And the two boys get the hay in there and get the cans out, and they come back stand behind their mom. And she asked Ron, she says, well, where are y'all hunting again? And Ron said, well, we're camped down here, about 3 miles down on this side of the road, but we're hunting on the other side. And she goes, well, look out for old such and such. And for the life of me, I have tried. Like I said, this was 1996, and I can't remember the name she used, but it almost sounded like a foreign name, almost French, I want to say, for some reason, but I can't remember the name. She said, look out for old such and such. It's an old hermit that stays up in there, and we take supplies to him sometimes. And when she said it, she lowered her head and kind of peeked over at the boys, and they lowered theirs, and they all snickered. Kind of like there was an inside joke about what she had just said to us. And right as that happened, I just happened to look. We're about 30 yards from the front corner of the house on the east side. And at the back corner on the east side of this little house, right underneath the eave, I see what appears to be the head, left shoulder, and left arm of a guy, very hairy guy with no shirt on, long beard, long hair, lean out from behind the house. Now his head's up at the eave on this house. I'm talking, 9, 10 feet. And he could have been standing on something, I don't know. But all I see is his head, his left shoulder, and his left arm. And he ain't got no shirt on. And I want to tell you, it's cold that year. That's why we were up there getting the hay. It was raining and it was cold. So it was around 20, low 20s probably, if I remember right. I got pneumonia that year. When I got back, I had walking pneumonia. I had to go to the hospital and everything. But anyway, this guy, this thing, didn't have no shirt on with it that cold. And he was hairy. I mean, that's all but I didn't say nothing. Like I said, I'm already freaked out by these two standing in front of me and this old woman. I mean, these aren't your average people, As I'm standing there, I'm already kind of weirded out, but I'm with this gigantic friend of mine, so I'm not scared, but I'm just keeping quiet. We get in the Jeep to leave, and I asked Ron if he saw it back there, seen it. And he said, no, I didn't. He goes, hell, those two are strange enough. And I said, yeah. But I said, Ron, this thing was, like I say, I'm talking to a guy at 6'8", 375, and I'm not exaggerating. I mean, he's 6'7.5", 6'8", 375. And I told Ron, I said, he made, whatever this was, unless he was standing on something, he made you look small, Anyway, we don't say no more about it and go on. Well, the next year, they brought these group brothers that I'd been camping with for 3 years, brought their wives and kids up there. And back in those days, you know, our deer camp was kind of, you know, we had a few, you know, we had a few, some alcoholic beverages and stuff in the evening. And anyway, my dad had decided to come up and camp right down the road from where they were at. He built an enclosure with his truck dogs. He was driving a flatbed truck at the time. And me and my brother and my cousin decided not to camp with these brothers because the kids and stuff were there, and you'd have to watch what you were saying and, you know, what you were drinking and this and that. So we went and camped with my dad. And my cousin was 2 years older than me. He wasn't much of an outdoorsman. He's a fisherman more than a hunter, but he was like me. I wasn't much of a hunter either, but I did it all the time because it's what I grew up doing, was taught to do. It's what my dad and brother did, and my whole family down here. But me and him, everybody else was going across the valley to hunt. My dad, his brother-in-law at the time, and my brother. Well, me and my cousin Danny were staying by our camp. We were walking up the mountain behind our camp to hunt. And there was a heavy game trail there that was being run pretty steady by a big buck. But anyway, we walk about, I don't know, probably 1,000 yards up the mountain behind our camp there. And time we get up there to this, what would be, I don't know if you're familiar with logging terms, but, you know, logging industry is heavy down here. What we would call an old push road, where those are leveled about 3/4 away up the mountain, had leveled a surveyor's trail, if you want to call it that, and on the glade there, and leveled out a spot, 8-9 feet wide. He said, hell, I'm just sitting down here. He didn't want to walk down to where that trail was. He was tired. So we had been up. We couldn't sleep that night. They put us by the door of the enclosure because it got down to 18 degrees. At 3:30 a.m. He woke me up. My cousin did. We was up by the door, so it was colder on us. He woke me up, and we checked the temperature, and it was 18 degrees. So anyway, he said, I'm just sitting down here. And I said, okay, I'm going to walk on down here to where that trail's at. It was about 450 yards probably from him. I got down there and sat down up against this tree overlooking this game trail. I probably had been there 5 minutes. And I heard something like I've never heard in my life. The loudest, the best way I can describe it, it was a yell, scream, holler type thing. And it was tremendously loud. And it sounded like it was right back where I just left my cousin. And I jumped up and, I'm concerned about him, but what I heard was the volume of noise was so great that I hesitated to head back that way. I'd never heard nothing like it, and nothing that loud in the woods. But I'm thinking, I don't know what this is, but hell, it may be killing my cousin. I've got to go and see if he needs help. And so I start heading back toward him. And I got about halfway there, and I see him heading toward me. And he's walking backwards toward me with his gun up on his shoulder. And so I step behind a tree and holler at him because I don't want him to wheel around and shoot at me, because I knew he had to be scared. Because, I could tell that by him walking backwards like he was and holding the gun up. And the noise sounded like it came right there from him. So I hollered at him. I said, Danny, it's Dean. I said, what was that? He goes, I don't know. Did you hear that? And I said, well, everybody heard that. What was it? And he goes, I don't know, but it was right behind me. And so I let him come to me. We stand there and talk about it. And neither one of us wanted to go back the way we had come up down there where the noise came from. So we made our way. It wasn't even a trail. We made our way down, about killed ourselves going back down toward camp. Right where we were standing at that point. We kind of made a trail to get down the mountain. Because we wasn't going back over there where that noise had come from. And Danny never left the camp the rest of that year. And he never went back in those woods again. The next day, I decided, being young, arrogant, cocky, I'm going to go back up there and just see you know, if I can see any sign of just trying to figure out, you know, what could have made a noise like that. And so I get back up to where he had, you know, where I'd left him on that glade. And I look around, I don't see nothing. And I decide that I'm going to go on up the mountain. And as I got on up there, it kind of opened up where what we were on was called the Nova Creek Wildlife Management Area at the time. It came down that far south in the Nova Creek Valley. They used to mark the boundaries between that and private property by paint strips on trees. When there was a fence line, one side would be one color, and I forget, for the public access land, and the other side, the paint strip would be another color for private land. Well, I come to a fence, and I could see it was marked on the tree, so I knew, you know, I couldn't cross that fence. So I'd be on private property. So I just kind of started walking down it toward the west. And I hadn't walked 20, 30 yards, and out in front of me on the private side of the fence, leaning out from behind this big tree, is what looked like what I'd seen the year before behind this house. And like I say, you know, it's 18, 19 degrees, 20 maybe by then, time I got up there. Once again, I'm seeing the right shoulder this time instead of the left. Like I did the year before, I'm seeing the head, the right shoulder, and right arm leaning out from behind a tree, looking at me from about 35 yards away. And gigantic, I don't, you know, estimate in height because it was leaning, you know, I mean, he was over, this thing had to be over 7 feet tall, without question, you know. From that distance, I could tell that. Unless it was standing on something. Once again, I couldn't see the lower half of its body. But it's just staring at me, not moving. And so I raise my hand, kind of wave at it, you know, let it know, you know, I see you, you know. Because I don't know what this is. You know, I don't know if it's a man or something like what I saw when I was a boy right here, 75. I don't know. It just looked unusual. And it don't move. It don't acknowledge my hand wave. And I thought, you know what? I was carrying a lever action Marlin 3030. And I have never cocked that on any kind of human or modern person or anything other than an animal I was hunting. But I cocked that rifle and I headed down that mountain. And I stopped 3 times on my way back to camp and sat and watched for 10, 15 minutes, making sure my back trail was clear, make sure this thing wasn't following me. Made it back to camp and told my cousin I think I saw what made the noise, and it's what I told you I saw with Ron last year. It looked just like what I saw that year before leaning out from behind that house.
Yeah, you know, Dean, I have so many questions for you. I want to back up for a moment. When you were a little boy and you ran into that creature when your dog ran off, yeah, a lot of eyewitnesses will say when it showed me its teeth, you know, like a non-human primate. You hear a lot of Bigfoot researchers go, well, non-human primates will show you their teeth when they're threatened or they're pissed, which is true. And sometimes eyewitnesses will say that. They'll say, man, it showed me its teeth and it looked like it was pissed. But then you'll also have other eyewitnesses that will say, yeah, it showed me its teeth, but God, it seemed like it was almost like smiling at me. And that was kind of your impression. I mean, did you get that impression based on the fact that it looked so human-like?
Well, exactly. This was no ape. You know, this was some kind of a man. That's why I say smile. And, you know, it had try to be sensitive here to your listeners, but it looked mentally challenged. You know, if you've been around adult folks that are mentally challenged, you know, I don't want to be, like I said, I'm trying not to be harsh here, but they'll have a kind of maybe a dull look, if you want to describe it that way, you know, a simple look about them. This thing had that. And so that in itself, you know, it wasn't, with the apes, when they show you the teeth, that's an intimidation thing, you know. It's showing, look what I got to do some harm to you with. Never got that impression with this thing because, like I say, this was no ape. I don't know what other people have seen around the world that they describe similarly. Maybe there's something else out there that's a little more primitive, more like an ape. I don't know. But what I saw in 75 up close, this was some type of a man. I say man because it had eyes, nose, ears, hands, feet, legs, arms, everything. It was built like a man, right down to the genitalia, This was a man of some kind. You tell me what a man that's gigantic in nature, covered in hair, with no clothes on, is doing in southwestern Pushpataw County, Oklahoma in 1975. I've struggled with that for almost 50 years, and I ain't never come up with a good answer, But what I have discovered over that time in this area, there has been other sightings. There's a family 2 miles west of here, late 2019, early 2020, that got ran out of their home over here, just 2 miles west. The children described the same thing as what I saw in 75. They described it identically according to the investigator. That one of the investigators that investigated these incidents that happened over here 2 miles west of where I'm sitting right now, where I had my sighting in 75. And one of them's a prominent guy from up here in Hughes County, Oklahoma, moved out of it. I don't know what your policy is. I don't want to put the guy on the spot, but everybody would know his name if I said it. And I didn't know, until I found this story in 2022 and put it together because they weren't open with the location. I just kind of, from some of the things they said, and I knew where he was at. He told me the distance, it took him to get down here. And anyway, I put it together that, they mentioned the name of the old road. Now they've got numbers on these county roads here in Push County, 94911 purposes. But back then, people roll around here still. They still use the old road names, that they've been there for years. And they mentioned that old road name, so I knew that it was right over here. So they're still seeing them around here. I don't think there's a lot of people investigating. There's one group here in Oklahoma, well, two actually that I know of that's done some investigating. But you got the Muddy Boggy just to the west of me, and you got McGee Creek State Park with the lake and McGee Creek and Catawba Creek, and Panther Creek, Bear Creek all feed into it from the north right over here. Just a lot of running water around here, fresh water. Big places. There's not a ton of people. Even though I'm sitting here right now, I can hear the traffic right here on Highway 3. The old house back in those days, the old highway was about 50 yards, 60 yards farther north. So where I seen it in the woods was probably 500 yards from the highway. I think there's still a lot of sightings around here. People just don't report them. They never have. They kind of keep it to themselves.
Yeah, and I know that in part 2, we're going to go into the return back to the property. It's interesting what you say about its appearance. I've talked to many eyewitnesses, and one thing they'll say often is it looked like it had Down syndrome.
Yeah, that's the term. And that's kind of, I guess you could use that term. I've heard that too over the years. I just said mentally challenged because, I don't know why I said that. That just, But I've heard that. I've heard Down syndrome too. Yeah, I guess you could describe it that way. But what I've seen in 75 up close, in daylight, it had that look about it. And of course, I could at night at the window. I was only 12 feet from it. I was actually closer at night.
Well, what do you make of it coming up? That whole behavior of it coming up to the window.
What do I make of it? I make of it intelligence, and what I mean by that is curiosity. And I think, well, I don't know how to say this right, but I think that children and women are not perceived as much of a threat as a modern man is to them. And so they'll come up closer and maybe watch longer, even if they're hidden. But I think they show themselves. Lady that owns the museum over here in Tallahassee, Oklahoma, I'm not going to use her name, but you can find her. She's public on social media and puts on a conference up here every year now. They just had it here a few months ago. But, she had a daylight sighting when they moved here from Dallas, Texas. They had been around the property. Her husband drove a truck. Long story short, one showed itself to her like it did me as a boy. And I think a lot of that has to do with they had watched her. And I think I'd probably been watched multiple times before it showed itself to me. Because it definitely showed itself to me. You know, I wouldn't have known it was there if it didn't want me to know as a boy, you know. I didn't stumble upon it. You know what I'm saying? I didn't sneak up on it. It had been watching me probably and just decided, you know, it's going to step out, you know. Ain't no telling how many times they'd watch me. But like I say, in this particular area, I'm convinced there's been a family group here for decades. Now, whether they stay here year-round, I'm not sure about that, you know. I think they're basically nomadic hunter-gatherers. They would have to be to live in the manner that it would take to survive. And, omnivores and opportunists as far as food, shelter, water's the key. Down here in this part of the world anyway. Anywhere around the water, if you go to researching it, you'll find that most of the sightings happen within close proximity of fresh water.
Yeah, it sounds like a good environment for them. I want to go back for a moment and talk about the lady you bought hay from with those two sons. How far away from your home is that lady's place that you bought the hay from?
Well, I'm sitting right now. I'm looking at that old house. It's the only thing left on the property from when I was a kid. I'm actually standing here at the door of the shop looking out at it. So it's probably 25 miles, maybe.
Yeah, as the crow flies, I mean, that old woman was pretty close to where you lived. There was an incident. I kind of want to jump ahead to 2000. Tell me about this incident in 2000.
Well, it was primitive arms season, late October, 2000. And my brother shows up at my house up in New Walla, Oklahoma, saying, hey, let's go to the mountains, you know. It's opening season. I'd never hunted primitive arms, you know. He had just got into it, but I'd never went with him. And, you know, we would hunt together during gun season. That's when I hunted, you know, which I wasn't an avid hunter. You know, I did it to get in the woods more than anything. And my father expected it. My family kind of expected it. But long story short, he shows up unannounced. I'd been up all night with a friendly young woman that I knew at the time, and they just got to bed. He shows up at 11:30 on a Friday morning, saying, let's go to the mountains and hunt. I said, I don't have a gun or anything. He said, I bought one of these new inline, whatever, black powder, fancy ones. You can use my old musket. And I'm thinking, hey, you know, where you going? He said, hey, we're going back up there to Cloudy, you know, where I've been hunting with Dad. And I knew there was a nice creek right there. And it backed up on a low water crossing. Made a nice little pool, about 300 yards long. Unbelievable fishing. So that's what I'm thinking. So I'm getting my pole, and he's hurrying me. And I said, well, you know, I didn't even have a gun at the time of any kind. I said, we need a gun for protection. Well, I've got my shotgun and my .357 and my Jimmy out there. And just, you know, come on, let's go. So I'm hurrying around, and I don't know what. I grabbed a sleeping bag and, you know, a coat and, you know, change of clothes and threw them in the bag. And anyway, he gets me in the truck quick, and I forget shit. And I found out later I forget some important stuff. But anyway, we head off to southeastern Oklahoma, and it's about 4 hours to get, a little over 4 hours to get from New Walla to Cloudy, which is where we were going. At that time, that area was still part of an Oba Creek Wildlife Management Area, so you could buy a $40 annual permit that gave you access for a year. For $40, you could access this property for 12 months. So we were hunting that a lot at that time. We quit hunting up there in One Creek Valley. I'd stayed up there longer than my cousin. Like I say, my cousin and my brother never went back in those woods up there in One Creek Valley after what happened up there. But my brother had to come down here to Cloudy and start hunting with my dad and my cousins, and they were successful. So, but I'd been up in there and I'd fished, so that's what I was going to do. I made sure I got my fishing stuff before we done. But anyway, we get there. So I've been up all night, and so the first night I went to bed early. I fished, and then right after dark, I got the tent. He bought a brand new tent. And one of those dome tents, one of the first ones they come out with, that popped up real quick and easy, And so I went in there and laid down and went to sleep. He stayed up. And my brother, he was a lot more of a drinker than what I was. He liked his beer, so he sat out there drinking beer. And, next morning, when I get up, he says, keep your eyes open. He says, I think I had two men, one from up the hill and one from down toward the creek, walk up and surround the camp last night. And I said, do what? And he said, yeah. He goes, sounded like two men walking. I'd walk out toward them, holler at them, and they were on either side of me. One was up the hill from me and one was down the hill, he said. He'd walk out toward them and he'd hear them walk away. And when he'd stop walking, he said they'd stop walking. He'd turn and walk back to camp, and they'd start walking back toward the camp behind him. But whenever he stopped, they would stop. They never would respond to him. He said, it was dark. He said, I couldn't tell how close I was to him. He was shining a light, but he never saw nothing. But anyway, he says, they may try to rob us. I said, okay. Where's that 357? So he goes to his truck. I said, that one shot, you got to reload them black powders. And I said, I want something else. And he can't find the 357. And I said, well, where's the shotgun you said you had in your Jimmy? He can't find it. He took them out to clean them, but he forgot. He'd never put them back in the Jimmy like he thought he had. So we're up there with just two black powder rifles is all we've got. And it's raining around, misty. Which is not a big deal for his new style, but my old musket, it's a big deal when there's moisture. Powder gets wet easy in those, and they don't shoot. But anyway, I let it go. Don't think about it. I'm going down fishing. I start catching fish. I forget all about it. It's not a big deal. And I put my gun up under a tree there, a big heavy pine. This pine forest is what it is. It's property's actually owned by one of the big timber companies, Weyerhaeuser, Georgia Pacific, Rainier. I'm not sure which owned it back then, but they give the state. They have a deal with the state to lease it. And that's what Three Rivers Wildlife Management Area down here in southeastern Oklahoma and Anoba Creek are actually Timber Corporation land. They have a deal with the state that allows you to access it for a fee. So anyway, that being said, we're out all day. We don't see each other. And he's out hunting all day, I guess. And I stay out fishing and actually fall asleep again down by the creek down there. Underneath the tree next to the gun there, it started sprinkling around. I got up underneath that big pine on the pine hill where it was dry. Went to sleep, but I don't know, probably, I guess, maybe an hour and a half before dark. Come back up, and I know he had said he had brought some deer meat for us to eat. So, boy, I got to digging around in the ice chest and sitting behind the tent. I find it. So I get it out. I start making dinner. Pretty soon he comes dragging in, dead dog tired, been hunting, hard all day. So we make a fine meal that evening, and big meal, really pigged out. And then it got dark by the time we finished, cleaned up, so we're sitting around the campfire there, which was about 7-8 feet off the back corner of that tent. Had a few beers. This was Saturday night. He goes, I'm going to sleep, I'm exhausted. Well, I'd got a good night. I'd been asleep that afternoon, slept good that night, so I was feeling pretty good. And I wasn't drinking the beer like he was. I'd had a few. And, I was full, but yeah, I was enjoying it. It was a beautiful night. The rain had quit. So I just stayed up by the campfire and thought, well, I'll let the campfire burn down, and watch it, because we're in a pine forest, You got to really be careful with your fires. Anyway, fire gets down to where I think it's safe. Burned out basically just some coals. I had brought a lawn chair to sleep on. Anyway, I go in and I'm trying to, this lawn chair kind of turned over when I get up that morning. Anyway, I'm trying to get it straight, get it out, and my brother's sawing logs right next to me on the other side of the tent on the cot. He don't even know what I'm doing. He don't even hear me. Well, anyway, I go to get on that lawn chair. That's one of them lawn chairs that lay flat, the old ones that used to lay flat, You see women suntanning on. There's one of those, so I could lay flat on it. But anyway, I tried to get on it. At that time, I was probably 215, and I got over on the leg too far, I guess, and that thing just buckled underneath me. That leg just bent. So there I am, my sleeping apparatus is ruined. So I go to folding it up and unzip the tent door and chuck it outside. Make out my sleeping bag on the floor of the tent, and I forgot a pillow when he was hurrying me to leave that day before. I forgot a pillow, so I was taking this brand new camouflage rain jacket. That's the first time I'd ever used it. I bought it that year sometime after last year's hunting season. And I'm using it as a pillow, and I stuffed it into the corner of the tent, back at the back where the ice chest was stacked on the outside. The fire is to my left, about 7-8 feet. But anyway, I wasn't laying there 5 minutes, and I started hearing a strange noise. And first, I don't know what this noise is, you know. It's very faint, you know, but I'm hearing it and it's steady. So I go to listen, and it's coming from, we were right in the corner of a T. There's the road T right there. The one that went down the mountain to the creek is washed out, and the other one went down about another 300 yards and ended up in the cul-de-sac. And then the other one was what you drove in on. So we're right there at this T where all these roads split, and under the trees, and I realized that noise coming from that road that went down the mountain that I'd been walking down to go down to the creek and fish. Had a big tin horn down there that was washed out, so you couldn't use that road no more. Anyway, it's coming from that road, it sounded like, right over there, about 25 feet, I would guess, on the north side of the tent. And pretty soon the noise gets closer, and I realize that what I'm hearing sounds like breathing of some kind. Like some kind of animal breathing. But my Lord, you know, I'm thinking of how far that road is and how I'm hearing this, and I'm thinking, what could be breathing that loud, you know? And so it had moved a little closer and just kind of stayed stationary, the breathing, or what I thought was breathing. I wasn't for sure at that point. And then it moved right up outside the tent, you know, kind of even with the tent, and just stayed there. It would stay motionless and stay in one spot for about 5 minutes. You know, it moved 3 different times. And as it got closer to the outside of the tent, the breathing got louder. And when it was right at, you know, the last time it stopped, it stood there or whatever, you know, stayed motionless. I could tell then that this was breathing I'm hearing. And I can't believe it, you know. I just can't believe how loud it is. And from 20 feet, I shouldn't be hearing breathing like that loud. So I'm trying to figure out what in the heck I'm hearing. And there was some cattle there was private property there, you know, not too far from where we were at. They would let their cattle loose to graze up on that wildlife management area. So I know there was cattle in there. And a lot of people don't know this, but there's wild horses down here in southeastern Oklahoma. A lot of people don't believe that, but there is. I've seen 100 of them if I've seen one. And so I'm thinking it's one of those two. It has to be, you know, or a bear. We have a lot of black bear down here, a lot more than most people think. Pretty soon, whatever this is comes off the road and walks in behind the tent, right in the back of me, behind my head, and stops. And it blocked out the moon. It totally made the tent go black, and the breathing's up above the top of this tent, which the top of the tent was about 5.5 feet, this dome tent, right? You just had to stoop over a little bit. I'm about 5'11", so I had to stoop over just a little bit. My brother could stand up in it. He was only about 5'8", but I had to kin just a little bit. But whatever this is that walked in behind the tent, the breathing's higher than the tent. That's obvious as I'm laying there listening. And it blocked out. We had a full moon that night. And when I laid down, I noticed that the moon was coming through the branches and, you know, lighting up the tent. And it blocked it out completely. So at this point, I'm realizing it'd been raining, and when we come in, we put the guns in the Jimmy. We never got them back out. I'm in this tent with nothing. My brother always carried a big hunting knife on his belt. I knew it was over there in his pants somewhere, and we had a little old battery-operated lamp in there. Other than that, I'm barehanded in here. And anyway, whatever this is starts shuffling the ice chest around right behind my head. And the breathing, like I said, once it got behind the tent, I can't comprehend this breathing that I'm hearing. I've been close to big animals in the zoo, close to every kind of big domestic animal you want to name. I've never heard breathing like this. This thing's taking in air and exhaling air, and taking 10 seconds to do it. I can't imagine the lungs, whatever this is. Shuffles the ice chest around, and at this point, I'm more than scared. I am really scared. So I pull the sleeping bag up over my mouth and stuff, trying to hide my breathing from whatever this is. I didn't want whatever this is to know where I'm at in that tent, right? It moves around right to the side of the tent where my head's at, and I hear a shuffling, and that breathing drops from up high, and it dropped right to my head. I'm on the floor, the bottom of the tent. I broke my chair, so I'm laying flat. My head on this camouflage jacket right in the corner. The breathing's right on the outside of the material of the tent, right against my head all of a sudden. Then it starts sniffing. When I say sniffing, I'm not talking like a normal animal, quick burst of sniffing. This thing was taking in air. I can't duplicate it. I'll cough. I'm a smoker, and I tried to duplicate it. I can't do it, but I can't even get close to how long it draws. It drew in air, then how long it exhaled after it sniffed. You know what I'm saying? I mean, big inhale, big exhale, right at my head. Well, at this point, I'm panicked. And I thought, well, whatever this is, I'm going to scare it off. So I raise up, and I slap the side of that tent as hard as I can, and I yell, "Hey!" the top of my lungs. I just hear a little shuffling. Whatever this is doesn't, I expected something to run off, right? I'm hoping something would run off. It didn't. The breathing just went high again. So it went from down low, and, I'm going to use the term stood up, because the breathing went high, and the next thing I hear is what sounds like water hitting the outside of the tent. My brother's coming to life after I'd yelled, "What are you?" And I'm over next to his cot at this point. I've done crawled over there on that side of the tent, and I'm covering his mouth so he don't say nothing, and I'm whispering to him, "Is this what you heard last night?" When I did that, he woke up, when I covered his mouth, it kind of startled him, and he looked over toward that side of the tent. He hears the breathing, and he hears what sounded like water hitting the side of the tent. And he said, "What in the blank is that?" And I said, "I don't know. Is this what you heard?" He said, "No, I didn't hear nothing like that. What is it?" I said, "I don't know. Walked in a few minutes ago, And it stood outside of camp and observed us. I heard the breathing, and then it came into camp. We're just talking normal now, because I know it knows where I'm at, because it dropped right to my head and sniffed me through the tent fabric. Like I said, I hollered. I know it. It knows we're in there. And then we start to smell urine. Whatever this was, when I hollered and hit the tent, it stood up and started pissing on the outside of the tent. And, so I'm telling my brother, he goes, I said, it's piss. I told him what I'd done, and he said, "Well, that's what must have woke me up, was you hollered." I said, it just raised up and started pissing on the tent. That was his only response to me doing that. I said, "I got to see what this is." So I grabbed his little lantern there. It was right by the head of his cot. The little bitty battery we used to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. And I head for the door to unzip it. He jumps up out of that cot and gets between me and the door. Pretty soon we're wrestling for the zipper on the door. He's like, "You ain't undoing that door." I said, I'm telling him, it knows we're in here, I just want to get a look. I'm just going to unzip it a little bit, just get a look. And like I said, he was my older brother for 3.5 years, shorter but stockier, and he was strong. And I didn't want to knock the tent down, so, I wasn't giving it my all, but we're wrestling around and arguing. And this thing moved when it quit pissing. It moved from the corner of the tent where it was urinating, where my head didn't land, to right outside the door. So it's standing right outside where we're standing. And, and I know this because of the breathing. You could hear the breathing plain as day. Over us talking, you could hear the breathing. That's how loud it was. And it's standing right outside the door like it was just waiting for us to open that door and look at it, Well, my brother ain't having none of it. Then whatever this is lets out a tremendous holler, similar to what I'd heard 3 years earlier with my cousin. It went through your body. I mean, it hit you like a concussion wave. And after it hollered, it turned and started walking down the hill. And as it went, we didn't know at the time, but we're hearing it. You start hearing tree breaks, tremendous tree breaks as it's moving away. It's not stopping to break these tree branches off. It's doing it as it's walking. Gets out of earshot, and my brother relaxes, and I move him out of the way, unzip it, hold the deal out. Of course, I don't see nothing. But what I noticed is that after it hollered and it walked off, what we were hearing breaking was 6-7 inch branches that were 10, 12 feet up in these pine trees. It was ripping them out of the trees and dropping them on the ground, but as it walked, apparently. And some of them, when I got to looking after I got out of the tent, some of them were twisted. They weren't pulled out of the tree. They were twisted in place, hanging from the tree. You know what I mean? And so I'm tripping over these branches trying to walk down this hill to get a look at it. And my brother's standing behind me going, "Where are you going, you idiot?" He's hollering at me. "You don't even have a gun." And I said, "Man, if it wanted to get us, it would have got us. I just want to get a look at it." So I follow it and I can hear it still. Once I got on down there, I could hear it out in front of me. So I follow it for probably, I don't know, maybe 60 yards with that little lantern. There was a spot where that tent on was washed out. That was a low spot. And I was on the outlet side when I dropped off this little hill. And it sounded like it was just on the other side of this little opening in the tree line, not far from me. And it had stopped moving. I couldn't hear it moving anymore. And once again, what my brother described the night before, it sounded like a man on 2 feet, but extremely heavy, But I realized that it quit moving. And I thought, well, I ain't going to walk into this thing, with no weapon. If it's right on the other side of this clearing like it sounded like it was, I'm not going any farther. And I turn and go back to camp. And we get the fire going again and get to talking about it. I brought up 75. We'd never talked about it. Like I said, the day I told you about 75, when I had the sighting twice, one day, me and my brother never talked about it. Me and my parents had never talked about it all these years, But I said to him, "Mike, do you think this could have been what we seen at our window when we were kids?" And he said, "I don't know what else. I don't know what else could it have been?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to tell you this. I don't know what it was." I said, "I damn sure know what it wasn't. There ain't no animal that I'm aware of up in these woods that can do everything that this thing just did. Just can't do it. No animal." Well, our father and his brother, his older brother, our uncle, showed up about a half hour before dawn, and we're telling them about it. My uncle was a preacher, and I never back-talked my uncle my whole life, but he made a comment, "Well, you dumb old city boys probably was a stray dog or a coyote or something." And boy, it made me mad, Might as well call me ignorant. So I let him have it pretty good. Cussed in front of him. I'd never done that. So let me tell you something. I know what it wasn't. I just don't know what it was. And I said, "Let me show you. Get up. Come over." I told him and my father. "Let me show you these branches down here. It pulled out and twisted when it left." My dad got up and came with me. It was the first time in my life he couldn't give me an answer. When I showed him what had been done to these trees, he couldn't give me an answer what done that. My uncle never would get up. He just, "Oh, you guys, just city boys up here got scared." He didn't want to look. But I also found what appeared to be right at the corner of my tent where it sniffed me or it dropped down to my head. Like I said, the fire was over there. We'd swept the pine needles away from where we built the fire. On the edge of those pine needle sweeps, where it was dirt, this was hard-packed rocky ground too up in this area. But I found what appeared to be an impression of what looked like the back half of a footprint, like a heel. And the rest of it was pressed down in the needles in the front, so there was no definition. And where it walked in off the road, when it got daylight, I looked and I found deep impressions into the pine needles. There was no definition, but these impressions were 5 feet apart and probably 20 inches long. where the fighting needles did not spring back up all the way, whatever had stepped and compressed them down was so heavy that they couldn't compress back up even with the rest of the needles. All that being said, don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't.
Yeah, there's so many accounts of Sasquatch peeing on people's tents. I've had many eyewitnesses on that have experienced this. I even had one guy on one time. He was in a hammock and he was out there in the woods, and one of these things actually peed on him. There's a little bit more to the story than that, but that behavior is so strange to me, but you do hear it a lot. And I want to get to this incident, the final incident that happened in 2015 with your return back to the property. And I'm so glad you're coming back for a part 2 because I have so many questions. One thing that's nagging on me, going back to that old woman that you bought hay from, what's your honest opinion on that whole situation? Because the way you describe it, it just sounds creepy.
It was more than creepy. Over the years, I thought about it. And Gus Stone, who made that documentary for the Southern Bigfoot Alliance, it was him and Brian Healy were the first two I ever spoke to about these things. First people that I didn't know. I'd only spoken to a few people, but those were the first people I didn't know that I spoke to when I decided to come out after all these years and talk about it. But he asked me the very same thing. He was like you. Gus is a very intelligent guy. So he said, all the other stuff's fascinating, but because I'm interested in that family, and and he asked me some very poignant questions. And one of them was, do you think that, they were talking about what you've seen, and it was one of these wild men, I call them wild men to guess, I hate the term Bigfoot, so I use wild man mostly. But anyway, I said, I wondered that very same thing. Because they actually told us, there's an old hermit, and they called it by a strange name, lives up in there that we take supplies to sometimes, don't shoot him. And then they looked at each other, kind of out of the corner of their eyes with their head down, the old woman and the two boys, and they chuckled like there was an inside joke, And like I said, I see this thing laying out from behind their house. So, that being said, it's really weird. I've had all kinds of things go through my head, after, all the research I've done. I've heard stories from the Native American stuff really intrigued me when I was young because, they told us about these things. When white men came over here in this part of the world, they told us about them, but we didn't believe them. They're ignorant savages, so we didn't believe them. But everything they told us back in those days, that's written down, what they told us, and what white men recorded, what they said, is really accurate. If you go back and dig, and it's all across North America. Almost every tribe has a word for it, and describes the same thing. But this family, I would use, in all honesty, I came to this conclusion. These boys were inbred. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around inbred hillbillies. I have, unfortunately, down here when I was very young. And that's what they reminded me of. Now, it's the first time I'd ran into them as an adult, anything like that, If my instincts, my gut tells me that they were product of close bloodline relationship. Now, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Wes, but I think what you're asking is, what was their relationship with what I saw? And I just don't know. They were aware of it, so they said they took supplies to a hermit. Don't shoot such and such. God, I wish I could remember the name. I have struggled. It's a name that I'd heard before. It's almost it's French sounding,
Yeah, the only French word I can think of, or French-like word, is the loup-garou, but that usually refers to something else, not Sasquatch.
No, it wasn't rougarou, but it was a similar sounding, and like I said, it was really strange. It's not something that even if you do remember it, your chances of pronouncing it right is going to be slim to none, But I think they were talking about what I saw behind the house, And what I saw the next year up there leaning out behind the tree, after my cousin and me had heard that vocalization, it looked like what I saw leaning out behind that house year before. I mean, the hair pattern, it didn't have black skin. It had real dark, leathery brown skin. This one did, with black hair. But it was about the same length of hair as what I saw in 75. Wasn't this big woolly, which I've looked into that, Wes, and I think in certain regions of the world where the climate's a little more harsh. In other words, like a dog. What's a dog do? Grows in more hair for the winter, doesn't it, than it sheds. Everything I've found makes me think these things may do that to some degree. I know that kind of sounds outlandish, but what I've seen wasn't shaggy-haired like I've seen other people describe,
Yeah, and for the audience, I'll be doing a part 2 with Dean tomorrow night with his return to the property. Man, I have a million questions for you, Dean. Kind of a last question I want to ask you tonight, and I ask everyone, and you got a great look at this creature, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, but what do you think Sasquatch is? And there's no wrong answer.
No, there's no right answer. We don't know. I mean, I think there's people that do know, but it's not public knowledge. What do I think they are? I think they, for the most part, I think they're hybrids. And what do I mean by that? I think there was an original bloodline, a big hominid, and I think there's still some left, and I think they're mostly in the northern reaches and the real remote areas where the bloodline's pure. But I think they've interbred with every type of primitive man there has been. How many primitive men do these so-called experts say that they found? That's just what they admit to. If you go down the line, and I have researched it, you got, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, Heidelbergensis, Australopithecus, the Cinnamons. Now they just found these little short hobbit-like, I can't remember what they called them, but they found them on the island of Florence here a few years ago. I think this original bloodline has interbred with other humanoids. So I think they're hybrids, is what we see around here. In most parts of the world, they're actually hybrids. That goes back to, Eastern Europe, Russia, Siberia, the Caucasus over there, what they describe as the Almosti. They're more man-like, than what people describe the Yeti being, the stuff in the high Himalaya. That's described as a little more animalistic. And that may be the actual original bloodline. Now, that's the only thing I can come up with after 50 years is mostly hybrid bloodlines between different hominids. They've interbred. Some of them have, multiple bloodlines. Some of them may just have 2. In other words, they're just like us, Wes. They're just like us. They are different heights, different weights, different sizes, different colors, different temperaments. I think if we can get past this animal thing, this ape thing, and think of them in terms of being like modern man, and having all the differences that modern man. A Chinese man doesn't look like a Native American man. A European man doesn't look like a Chinese man. You know what I'm saying? Polynesian doesn't look like a Russian. So I think that's what you get with these. I think they can be different, depends on what part of the country you're in, and based on environment and diet. That's why you get so many different descriptions, I believe.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Dean. That's a fair answer. It's one of the questions I struggle the most with. Matt Pruitt and I were talking about this last week. Why is it that some of the eyewitnesses say what I saw looked like a great ape? I mean, they had a human nose and some features that are human-like. And then you get other eyewitnesses that are like, no, what I saw was a man or, a woman. It was a prehistoric humanoid type creature, very human-like in the face. And I'm so glad that you're coming back for a part 2, Dean. I can't wait. And I can't wait to hear, because I know when you went back to the property after, 40, 50 some odd years, and you're there now, there's been some weird things that have happened that didn't happen when you were younger, and I want to talk to you about those. But thank you so much for taking the time to come on for this part 1. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Hey, no problem, buddy. It's good to talk to you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks again, Dean. And join me tomorrow night as we wrap up with the Chronicles of Dean and the whole part 2 of him going back to the property. You definitely don't want to miss it. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out Sasquatch Chronicles